Hello, and welcome back to My Idea Way. I'm Hayden. Today, I want to start with a situation that I think is harder than it sounds. Imagine you're handed a company that is massive, profitable, and has one of the most recognizable names in industry. The employees are smart, the products work and are sold, and you make a ton of money per year. But something underneath the numbers has gone wrong. The company isn't failing in any measurable way. It's just slowly becoming irrelevant in the way that a very confident person can become irrelevant by being too attached to what they already know to notice what's changed around them. That's what Satya Nadella inherited when he became the CEO of Microsoft in 2014. And I think it's almost a harder leadership problem than inheriting a company that's in crisis, because when a company is clearly failing, the case for change makes itself. When the numbers look fine, when the brand is still famous, when the products still sell, the case for change has to be made against the evidence. You have to convince people that the thing that's been working is becoming the thing that will eventually stop working. And you have to do all that while also running the company well enough that it doesn't fall apart while you're making your changes. That's what makes Nadella's story interesting to me. It's not the strategic moves that he made, the cloud pivot, the acquisitions, the AI investments. Those are the outcomes. The more interesting thing to me is the shift in thinking he had to produce in his company before any of those moves were possible. Because you can't make good decisions about where to go if the culture around you systematically punishes the kind of honest thinking that produces good decisions. And Microsoft, by a lot of accounts, had that problem in a serious way by the time that Nadella took over. To understand what Nadella walked into when acquiring Microsoft, it helps to spend a little time on what Microsoft had been before Nadella. The company had essentially defined the personal computer era. Windows and Office became so pervasive that for a generation of people in all, Microsoft was computing. The company's strategy during that period was mostly about protecting and extending that dominance in computing, making sure that Windows remained the platform everything ran on, and that Microsoft controlled as much of that experience around that platform as possible. That strategy worked very well for a long time. The company became one of the most valuable businesses in the world. And then gradually, the strategy began working less well, not because their products stopped selling, but because the world was moving elsewhere. The smartphone didn't run Windows. People started storing things in the cloud instead of on their machines. The software started living on browsers instead of on hard drives. The developers and startups building the next generation of technology were increasingly moving toward open source tools and platforms that Microsoft had historically treated with hostility over the years. And the internal culture that had developed around years of near total dominance in this computing industry had some real problems. The most documented one in Microsoft was a practice called stack ranking. It was a performance evaluation system where managers were required, actually, by the company to grade employees relative to each other on a forced distribution. A fixed percent had to be rated excellent, a fixed percent average, a fixed percent poor, regardless of how the team actually performed overall. I kept coming back to that sort of distribution while researching, because the effects of that system on a company's ability to learn are almost exactly what you predict if you thought about that distribution carefully. When your performance rating depends not on your contribution to the team, but your ranking relative to your colleagues, the rational thing to do is to not help your colleagues. Sharing knowledge that might make a teammate look better can make you look worse and become a poor performer. Bringing a problem forward can be more dangerous than keeping it quiet, because visibility on that problem as it pertains to you creates comparison, and comparison is how you get ranked. People started optimizing for looking right rather than being right, for appearing productive rather than actually moving things forward. The organization was full of immensely talented people who had been trained by that sort of incentive structure to use their intelligence defensively. This is the dynamic that Dalio was trying to design around when he built radical transparency at Bridgewater. The thing that Dalio understood was that an organization's ability to make good decisions depends entirely on whether accurate information actually reaches the people making decisions. And in most organizations, the social and political cost of bringing the bad news in, of disagreeing with someone senior, or of admitting uncertainty is massive. And people under that cost learn not to do it. The information that gets filtered out is often exactly the information that matters most to the people high up in the company. It could be the early signs of a massive problem, the honest assessment of a failing strategy, some engineers concerned that a product isn't ready. Grove made essentially the same observation about strategic inflection points. The companies that miss them aren't missing them because nobody inside saw the signals. They're missing them because the culture made it too costly for the people who saw the signals to say so out loud. Microsoft had built a culture that was systematically degrading its own intelligence. And the fix wasn't really a new strategy. It was a different way of thinking about what intelligence was actually used for. The phrase Nadella used was the difference between a know-it-all culture and a learn-it-all culture. And honestly, the first time I read it, it sounded a little bit like corporate self-help language, like something you put on a poster in a break room. But the more that you dissect it and you realize what it's actually pointing at, it seems more serious than that. Because the know-it-all problem isn't about people who are literally arrogant or who think that they know everything. It's more subtle than that. It's about what happens when an organization starts rewarding the performance of certainty over the practice of learning. When looking confident becomes more valuable to a company than being accurate. That produces a very specific kind of organizational failure that's hard to see from inside of it because it doesn't look like failure. It looks like a bunch of very capable people who are very confident in their work. The meetings that are conducted are filled with smart-sounding presentations. Everyone has data to support their position. Everyone can articulate why their project is the most important. But underneath that activity, the company has lost the ability to update. It can execute on a plan that's already committed to very effectively. What it can't do is hear evidence that that plan is wrong and change courses. The research Nadella leaned on here heavily came from Carol Dweck, a psychologist at Stanford who spent decades studying how people think about their own abilities and what that thinking does to their actual performance. Her core finding is the distinction between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. I know I've already done an episode on the growth mindset, but that was very far back, so we're going to go over it again here. People with a fixed mindset believe that their abilities are essentially stable traits, that you're either good at something or you're not, that challenges reveal your limits rather than expanding them. People with a growth mindset believe that abilities develop through effort and through learning, that getting something wrong is information rather than a binary verdict, that difficulty is the mechanism of improvement rather than evidence of not being good enough. What's interesting about Dweck's research isn't just that growth mindset people perform better, which they do. It's how the mindset shapes the relationship with failure and uncertainty. Fixed mindset people tend to avoid situations where they might fail because failure is a permanent statement about who they are. That means that they tend to stick with what they're already good with and stay away from anything that might reveal a gap in their abilities. Now, scale that dynamic up to the size of a company, and you get a company full of people who've been rewarded for competence and ranked against each other. And that organization is deeply resistant to honest self-assessment. The collective ego of the institution starts protecting itself in the same way that an individual ego does. Nadella's argument was that the learn-it-all mindset needed to become more organizational rather than just personal. Not just individual employees being more open to feedback, but the whole system, the structures, the incentives, the cultural norms, shifting toward rewarding accurate thinking over impressive sounding certainty. That's a harder change to make than just changing a strategy, because you can announce a new strategy in a press release. You can't announce a new culture. You have to actually actively build culture through thousands of individual decisions about what gets rewarded, what gets promoted, what gets set out in meetings, what happens to the person who points out something that isn't working. One of the most significant cultural signals Nadella sent out early was around how Microsoft related to the outside world. For most of its history, Microsoft had treated its competitors and alternative tech ecosystems with hostility. Linux, the open source operating system, had been called a cancer by the previous Microsoft CEO. The company had been famous for its actions where they would use its platform dominance aggressively to try and foreclose their competition or to make it harder for other technologies to coexist with Windows. And then under Nadella, Microsoft started not just tolerating open source software, but actually contributing to it. The company that had once called Linux a cancer made Linux a central part of its cloud infrastructure. Microsoft started releasing its own tools as open source. It eventually even acquired GitHub, the platform where most of the world's open source software actually resounds nowadays. I think that shift actually between hostility to competitors and embracing them needs more attention than it usually gets, because it's not actually a business story, it's a culture story. Microsoft wasn't embracing open source because it became philosophically convinced that software should be free. It was embracing open source because the developers it needed to attract and actually have were already living in that world. And the company that it used to be that refused to show up where its most important people already were was going to keep losing them to Google and to Amazon and to the dozens of startups that were being built on open source. But the ability to make that move required letting go of rivalry and letting go of their previous worldview that had defined the company for years. That is what actual organizational learning looks like. It's not updating your beliefs or just sending out an email, because that's costless. Changing your behavior when continuing the old behavior would protect your identity but hurt your future. This is actually almost exactly the move that Intel had to make during my episode on Andy Grove. Staying in the memory chip business was comfortable because it was familiar to Intel, and it was what Intel's identity was built around. Leaving it required accepting that the identity the company had been built around in memory chips was less important than the purpose underneath it, which was to build the technology that mattered. Nadella had to do something structurally similar with the Windows-centric identity that Microsoft had built. Windows wasn't going away, but it couldn't remain the center of gravity around which every decision in Microsoft orbited, because the world had already moved past the era where that made sense. The pivot to cloud computing is the most concrete expression of this in Nadella's actual actions. Nadella had been running Microsoft's cloud and enterprise business for years before becoming CEO, so he understood the model not as an outside bet, but from years of actually building it from the inside. The basic idea of cloud computing is that organizations don't need to build and maintain all their own computing infrastructure. They can rent it from a provider like Microsoft. They can access storage, computing power, software, and services over the internet and pay only for what they use. That model changes the relationship between a tech company and its customers. You're not selling someone a product and sending them home. You're becoming a part of how they operate from their day-to-day business continuously. And that continuous relationship creates accountability in a way that a one-time setup can't. If your cloud platform goes down, a hospital can't access patient records. A bank can't process transaction. A retailer can't take orders. You're not selling someone a piece of software. You're embedded into their infrastructure, which means that your incentives are aligned with their success in a way that they aren't when you've already collected the purchase price and shipped off your software, you know? And that means that trust matters in a way that's immediate. And it's more specific than just having a changing brand reputation. One major outage, one serious security failure, and you're not talking about a PR problem. You're talking about breaking the operational continuity of the organizations that built their work on top of you. Microsoft Azure grew into one of the company's most important businesses under this model, and the transition of Office into Microsoft 365 moved what had been a periodic software sale into a subscription relationship. But I think the deeper significance of the cloud strategy in Microsoft was what it said about what Microsoft was becoming. Naval Ravikant has this framework where he distinguishes between products and platforms. A product creates value for the person who uses it. A platform creates value by letting other people build things on top of it, extending its capabilities in directions the original creator couldn't have anticipated or built themselves. Windows had always been partly a platform in that sense, giving developers a common environment for building software. Azure was extending that same logic into the cloud, building infrastructure that other businesses could build their operations on. GitHub also extended this further into the layer where software actually gets created. The question Nadella was really asking about Microsoft's future was whether the company could become the foundational layer under other people's work, rather than trying to own every single part of the experience itself. I also want to spend some time on the empathy part of Nadella's thinking, because I think it's the easiest part of his thinking to misread. When a tech CEO starts talking about empathy, it often sounds like window dressing, a way of softening what's pretty much an aggressive corporate strategy with language that sounds like humane. And I went into this episode somewhat skeptical about his framing because, what I said before. But the more I read about how Nadella actually uses the concept of empathy, the more I think that it's doing something genuine and specific that's worth taking seriously in his company. Nadella has talked about how his thinking about empathy was shaped in a very personal and difficult way. His son, Zane, was born with cerebral palsy and has significant disabilities. In interviews and in his book, Nadella describes an early reaction that was, by his own account, pretty self-centered. He thought about what this moment meant for his own expectations and for his plans, for the family that he imagined having. And then, over time, he had to genuinely sit with what it was like to be Zane, not what it was like for Nadella to experience having a son with Zane's challenges. What it was actually like to be inside Zane's experience of the world. That's an amazing cognitive and emotional task. It's amazingly hard. It requires setting aside your own perspective well enough to actually inhabit someone else's. That experience shaped how he thought about product design, which is kind of, I don't know, it's kind of funny, in a way that I think is just more about biographical color. Technology, especially technology built by skilled engineers at well-resourced companies, tends to be designed for people who are a lot like the engineers who built it. Fast internet, specific physical abilities, certain kinds of literacy, a set of cultural assumptions. And when a product is designed for that default user, it works amazingly for them. And it creates invisible barriers for everyone who doesn't fit that exact profile. Someone maybe using a screen reader, someone in a rural area or disadvantaged monetarily with slow internet, someone whose first language isn't the one the interface was designed in, someone with limited income who can't afford the premium tier of the product. These aren't edge cases in terms of numbers. They represent the majority of the actual human population, but they become edge cases in the product design because when the people making decisions have never had to think seriously about experiences different from their own. Empathy, as Nadella means it, is the capacity to do that kind of thinking, to ask what it's like to be someone whose situation is different from yours, and to let the answer change what you build. It's not like a soft skill. It's a form of intelligence, and it's one that has effects on the quality of what gets produced. Microsoft's accessibility work, its investments in technology for people with disabilities, its attention to different kinds of users in different contexts aren't charity projects. They reflect a belief in the company that the company should serve a broader range of human experience than its default assumptions would suggest. And this connects to something that I think is the deepest version of the learn it all idea. The most fundamental thing you can learn is that your own experience is not the whole of human experience. The way that things look from where you're standing is one perspective on a much larger situation. That the user who's struggling with your product isn't struggling because they're stupid or they're unsophisticated. They're struggling because the product was designed without them in mind. That's a humbling idea to absorb, and it requires exactly the kind of ego management that Dahlia was talking about. The capacity to hold on to your own perspective loosely enough to actually take in someone else's. The AI chapter of Microsoft's story is where I want to spend the last part of this episode, because it's where the learn it all philosophy faces its hardest test. Microsoft made a major investment in OpenAI and integrated large language model technology across its products in a way that moved faster than almost anyone in the industry expected. Copilot tools appeared in Word, Excel, Outlook, Teams, Azure, GitHub. The company positioned itself at the center of what looked like a genuine platform shift, the kind of shift that Nadella had been studying and thinking about before he became the CEO of Microsoft. And on one level, the story looks clean. The company that transformed itself from Windows-centric rigidity to cloud-era relevance has once again positioned itself at the front of a major technological transitions. The learn-it-all culture worked, the preparation paid off, but I think that reading is too comfortable. And I think Nadella himself would say so, because the actual questions around AI are more uncertain than the cloud transition was. When Microsoft moved to the cloud, the basic technology was well understood. The challenge was organizational and strategic, convincing a company that had built its identity around a different model to restructure itself around the new one. The technology itself was fairly stable. AI is different. The systems being deployed right now are doing things that nobody fully understands from the inside. The researchers who built them describe their behavior, but can't always explain it mechanistically. The effects on employment, on education, on the info environment, on creative work, on how decisions get made inside organizations. These are genuine concerns that aren't just PR language about responsibility. Nobody knows. And companies are moving fast partly because they have competitive pressure, but also because moving fast has become a kind of cultural default in the tech industry, something that gets rewarded by markets and celebrated by the press, even when the appropriate pace might be slower. This is where the Archimedes lesson comes back. The lever amplifies whatever you're applying it to. AI is an extraordinarily powerful lever, and more powerful leverage makes the question of what you're applying it to more important. A feature released at scale to hundreds of millions of people that turns out to have a flaw doesn't just affect one user or one company, it affects everyone simultaneously. The scale that makes the technology valuable is the same scale that makes its failures insurmountable. Seneca would probably have something uncomfortable to say here, something about how the gap between what a person or an institution knows and what they act like they know. The learn all culture Nadella built is predicated on intellectual honesty about the limits of your knowledge, but the pressure to be seen as leading in AI, to announce new features and capabilities, to not fall behind competitors who are also racing forward, creates incentives to project more certainty than actually exists in your field. The same ego protection mechanism that made Microsoft's old culture brittle can reemerge in a new form. Instead of protecting the identity of the Windows company, you're protecting the identity of the AI leader. The mechanism's the same. Essentially, the mechanism is the same. I don't say this to be cynical about what Nadella has built. The transformation of Microsoft over the past decade is one of the most remarkable organizational stories of the tech era, and a lot of it is attributable to the culture shift he led. But the whole point of a learn-all philosophy is that learning never finishes. The moment you decide you figured it out on how to be a learning organization is the moment you've started becoming a know-it-all about learning. The culture has to remain a behavior, not just a reputation. And the behaviors that protect intellectual honesty, the willingness to say you don't know, to slow down when moving fast creates risk that outpaces understanding, to genuinely weigh the interests of users who aren't in the room where decisions get made. Those behaviors are harder to maintain when the stakes are high and the competition is intense. There's something in this that also connects to what Chouinard was wrestling with at Patagonia. Chouinard built a company around a set of values, not performative values. And then he had to watch those values get tested over and over again as the company grew and became more commercially successful and faced more pressure to make compromises that were financially responsible, but went against those values. The values only stay real if they change decisions. A commitment to honest uncertainty about AI's effects only means something if it occasionally results in moving slower or not shipping a feature that would have generated revenue but wasn't ready. Otherwise, it's just language. This is something I kept coming back to and couldn't fully resolve because I think it's unresolved. The learn-it-all Microsoft under Nadella is meaningfully different from the know-it-all Microsoft it was becoming under the previous leadership. The changes in culture and strategy and how the company relates to the outside world are real. And simultaneously, Microsoft is a gigantic corporation with enormous financial incentives, competitive pressures, and the structural tendency towards protecting its current position that creates the problem in every successful organization. Nadella has managed that tension better than most. Whether he's solved it permanently or whether it's just reappeared in AI, it is something we genuinely don't know yet. What I think is unambiguously true And what I think is the most transferable thing from his story is something simpler. The identity of a know-it-all, the need to appear certain, to protect the positions you've already taken, to be the person with the right answer rather than the person with the best question, is expensive in ways that are easy to miss until the bill arrives. It makes organizations less intelligent and makes individuals less capable of growth. It creates the conditions that Grove was warning about, the culture that punishes the people who bring the bad news, that stops receiving the information it most needs. The alternative isn't the absence of confidence or conviction. Nadella is an amazingly confident leader. He made enormous bets. He moved the company in a clear direction. But there's a real difference between confidence that comes from genuine understanding and certainty that comes from needing to appear like you know what you're doing. One is compatible with learning. The other is incompatible with it by definition. And the difference between them shows up not in how their leader, like Nadella, talks about learning in a keynote speech, but in what happens in the room when someone brings evidence that contradicts the plan. James Clear writes about identity-based change, the idea that the most durable changes aren't the ones where you set a goal and try to achieve it through willpower, but the ones where you genuinely shift how you see yourself. Not, I'm trying to read more, but I'm a reader. Not, I'm trying to be more careful, but I'm someone who checks their work. Nadella was trying to do something like that at an organizational scale, not just change Microsoft's strategy, but change how Microsoft understood its own identity. From the company that had won the PC era to the company that was still curious about what came next. That's different fundamentally than a strategy shift. Strategies change when the evidence changes. Identity changes when you decide that what you've been protecting isn't actually the most important thing to you. For Microsoft, the thing it had been protecting was its dominance of a particular technological era. Nadella was trying to get the company to care more about remaining useful in whatever era was coming, and then about preserving what the version of itself had been useful about the previous version of itself. The question that I'm left with, and that I think is the most honest place to end this episode, is whether that shift is something that you can permanently build into an institution, or whether it's something that has to be actively maintained, rechosen, and redemonstrated every single time that the pressure to revert shows up. I personally suspect it's the latter. I suspect that learn it all is less a state you achieve and more a practice that you commit to, and that commitment gets tested every time success makes the old certainties feel safe again. Which means the most important version of Nadella's lesson isn't Microsoft. It's about the version of this problem that shows up everywhere. In the student who got good at one subject and is afraid of the subjects where they might look less capable. And the athlete who mastered one technique and resists changing it even when the evidence suggests that something about it isn't working. The learn-it-all choice isn't made once. It's made every single time you encounter a question you don't know the answer to, and have to decide whether that uncertainty is something to hide or something to follow and to unpack and to live with and to grow from. Thanks for listening to One Idea Way.